Half-a-day students, I am Governor Lou Leon Guerrero. You all have been through a year of big changes. We've had to adapt and make big changes to keep our families and our island safe. But with change comes opportunity and a chance to try new things like PBS University. While Lieutenant Governor Josh Tenorio and I will continue to do our part to keep our island safe, you students have a part to play as well. Your part is to keep learning and to keep up with your lessons. That's why I am happy to see you here ready to learn with PBS University. PBS University is a way to bring a continuous educational curriculum to you while you stay safe at home during this time. To help you keep up with your studies, we asked our friends at PBS Guam and the Guam Department of Education to put together this episode. Thank you for doing your part and have a great lesson.
Humanities Guåhan, an independent nonprofit organization affiliated with the National Endowment for the Humanities, is dedicated to promoting public humanities programming for the people of Guam and providing foundational support and educational resources for our island community. For more information about Humanities Guåhan, visit www.humanitiesguahan.org. The following webinar series is part of a project presented by Humanities Guåhan entitled Unincorporated, Voting, Voices, and Visions Para Guåhan. This project explores Chamorro stories, experiences, and perspectives on civic engagement in relation to voting rights, democracy, political status, and Chamorro self-determination. Unincorporated consisted of the 5-part webinar series that took place from January through May 2021 and covered topics on the origins of Chamorro self-determination, the work of the Commission on Decolonization, the relationship between art and decolonization, and the role of the U.S. legal system as it relates to Guam's political status. The project culminated with the launch of an online and printed magazine distributed throughout the community, which consists of essays, creative reflections, and artwork exploring issues around Guåhan's political status and decolonization through the perspectives and historical and political experiences of the Chamorro people of Guåhan.
About a few months before the Organic Act of Guam, President Truman did exercise his executive authority to transfer the management of Guam away from the Department of the Navy and turned it over to the Department of Interior, and then in full anticipation of the creation of the Organic Act. And so the next slide will be a view of the Treaty of Paris. There they are. They're not part of the creation. They're not part of the management. They're not part of the request. They're not part of the action. They're simply being transferred from one country to another in terms of the Treaty of Paris. And this stayed until World War II. So you had 1898 and you had the given Guam and you had the Declaration of Unincorporated Territory, and this stayed until World War II. And then World War II created a whole series of other events, and that's the next slide.
Thank you, Dr. Underwood. We'll now close this off as our first segment, and I wanted to open up the opportunity for questions and answers. And we do have a question that just came in, Dr. Underwood. The question is, there has been much talk of tribal status or tribal recognition among my peers recently. In your opinion, do you believe moving in that direction to be a hindrance to CHamoru self-determination or a benefit?
Well, that's not pertinent to this part of the, but I don't think tribal status is part of Chamorro self-determination. And the tribal status belongs to the native inhabitants of the U.S. when the U.S. was created. And so that tribal status, it's mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. those apply to the Aboriginal groups of the United States as it existed at the time. In order to apply those to Guam, then the people of Guam would have to kind of incorporate as a tribe and then petition the federal government to acquire tribal status. So, you know, there's already a lot of other tribes. I just see it as kind of a difficult political process to navigate. But in any case, the way we get out of this is we get out of unincorporated territory status. We don't get out of it by all of a sudden proclaiming some different situation all along. And sometimes the terms get a little confusing because we use the terms indigenous, and then we use the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, and we sort of assume that, you know, all indigenous peoples are the same, or they all have the same history. They don't all have the same history, and they have a different relationship to the government which instituted them. And in this case, the origin of Guam's relationship to the United States is the right of conquest. And that right of conquest took sovereignty away from the people of Guam. And so in order to get out of it, you have to sort of give it back to them for, you know, at least half hour until they decide what they want to do. That's really the basis for, that's the basis for this. That's the basis for Chamorro self-determination.
Thank you. I was going to ask you about the right of conquest, but in going over the previous slide, you discussed a little bit about the acknowledgement of Native and inhabitants' civil and political rights. But what happened to the right of self-determination? Wasn't there a question? Or
yeah, so well, it's a fair question, but it's like you know, at the time that the Spanish governed or forcibly took Guam and proclaimed the right of conquest, there was no such thing as sort of recognizing what to do with these people. They had a thing in the Council of Indies inside the Spanish government, but that was like how to treat them fair as a political concept didn't really emerge until World War I. When coming out of World War I, they had to do something with all these small national groups inside Europe. So Woodrow Wilson created this notion of self-determination, that the United States was fighting for the self-determination. Well, not the self-determination of the people of Guam, but for the self-determination of these national groups inside Europe. Then at the end of World War II, the concept of self-determination was sort of incorporated into the United Nations Charter, and then came full blossom into the UN Declaration, UN Resolution 1541, which is the resolution that created the system of non-self-governing territories in the UN today.
Malik, thank you. We do have a question from the audience. I don't know if you want to address this now or later through the presentation, but the question is, what is the difference between the terms territory and colony?
There's no difference. You know, colony presumes, you know, colonies had, the word colony has had a good and bad press, all legal concept, because I don't think you can't go to court and say we're a colony, and where do you find the word colony in the law? But you do find territory. And so territory and the unincorporated territory and the incorporated territory are defined legal concepts in American jurisprudence. So territory has a real meaning.
Here we go. Here's another question. Are the CHamoru and the Taotao one and the same people?
Well, historically, they are one and the same people, but they've gone through a lot of changes. So obviously, I introduced the word Chamorro because the word the word CHamoru was not used at the time of the Taotao. It wasn't really widely used until the 1800s, until the 19th century. And so it's continued to today. And so, you know, sometimes for a period of time, Guamanian was used as a kind of a modernized word for CHamoru. And then now Guamanian has gone off in an entirely different direction. So now everyone is a Guamanian. So basically, CHamoru refers to the natives. And that was how it was used in the 1800s. And the tåno are basically that's a kind of a CHamoru concept. You have people of the land and people who are not of the land. You have Tautauhaja, people from the inland, and Tautolago, people from the outside. So that's basically.
Just one other question to add to that. Were the Taotao different from that presumably older people? I guess.
Well, of course, 3,500 years of history. They're not this. It's going to be, I mean, the problem is that people think in static terms. Even before the Europeans came here, there were lots of changes. There was either the creation of the lattice stone, and that created enormous changes in CHamoru society. So the idea that there was this kind of like static society and then nothing happened until the Europeans showed up, and then the Spaniards came and there was this conflagration, and then nothing happened and until the Americans showed up, and nothing happened until the Japanese showed up is a denial of the passage of time, and the people here were doing different things. So yeah, obviously they weren't exactly the same people, but if you ask me the question, could I have a conversation in CHamoru with Matapang, who's over here? He's over here somewhere. Yeah, he's back here. I'm at the Dusatani. He's over here next to the reef. If I have a conversation with Matapang or Hurao, in CHamoru, yes, I could. It'll be a little difficult and a little stilted, but it'll still work. So yeah, I feel like we're the same people. I sometimes make I said, that's just like, Elton John or Mick Jagger having a conversation with William Shakespeare. Of course, they're not speaking English the same way. And of course, they'll have a little bit of, going back and forth at each other, but it's still English. And it's still CHamoru.
Maulik, and perfect timing for that kind of discussion with the recent release of the orthography too. So thank you very much. We'll go ahead and move on to your next segment of your presentation.
Okay, so on the next slide, we have coming out of World War II. There we go. So you had the Japanese occupation, and the people of Guam, of course, the CHamoru people underwent a lot of stress, and there were a lot of changes, dramatic changes that came out of World War II. Not just the war itself, but the fact that you had a huge military presence. You had lots of land moving around, and people felt that their land was taken away, and you had issues coming out of World War II. And who are we? What is our future like? So most of the time, people thought that we would get better treatment if we were US citizens. So the quest for US citizenship was ramped up. And you had the primary leaders of that were F.B. Leon Guerrero and Antonio Wampat. And that quest for citizenship meant that they felt that would be like the next stage. So if people of Guam were US citizens, then the military couldn't treat them so badly in terms of land and economic policies. It's important to note that there was a lot of economic activity going on. There was a lot of discrimination in wage structures. There was a lot of expropriation of land under very strange circumstances. All of this was going on. So while people were relieved that the war was over and they were no longer experiencing the Japanese occupation, there was enormous change, and they weren't part of that. They weren't part of managing that. That was managed primarily by people in uniform from the Navy. So the quest for citizenship was revived in earnest. It had a little bit of pre-World War II action, but was revived in earnest. And there was a new international climate coming out of World War II. And there were also some people in Washington, D.C. and the U.S. who were friends of this citizenship movement. Laura Thompson, or Harold Ickes, John Collier, I think it was Laura Thompson's husband, and a whole group of people. They started an organization. And so in combination, you started to feel a sense of movement and change. And at the same time, you had the United Nations, according to Article 73 of the United Nations, they created this non-self-governing territory list. What were you going to do with areas that were not fully self-governing? So the UN said, we're going to create an article for them, and that's Article 73. On the basis of that article, the United States voluntarily, along with the United Kingdom and along with France, they voluntarily put their non-self-governing territories on a list. And then they annually reported on them starting from 1946 and what their progress was going to be, that there was going to be this full commitment to political self-development. Not quite, the term self-determination was not quite yet used until the 60s, but, you know, advancement, political development, monitoring, all of these things were kind of implied by this process. And I always point out that, you know, the UN Charter is a treaty, and treaty is treated as law in US jurisprudence. So it's not something that you can just say, well, we don't have to listen to it. No, you do have to listen to it. People can take you to court over this because these things are kind of legal obligations. So all of that movement then created the Organic Act. So the Organic Act, the main provision of the Organic Act was to create US citizenship for the people of Guam. So how do you determine who are the people of Guam? Well, the Congress, this congressional act determined who the people of Guam were. And basically they recognized the Chamorro people two different ways. One is they said that people of Guamanian ancestry, and everybody in 1950 knew who were Guamanians, unlike today. Everyone's confused today, but in 1950 it was pretty clear who were Guamanians, and people of Guamanian ancestry should have preference in hiring in the government of Guam. So there was clear legal provision for that. That's an act that the US Congress could affirmatively discriminate on behalf of an ethnic group simply by passing a law, because Guam was an unincorporated territory, and Congress can decide what to apply to Guam and what not to apply to Guam. So that's a very important provision. And then secondly, determining who were going to be citizens. It said if it was meant for Guamanians, and if you weren't clear who you were, you had to have ancestry in Guam going back to 1898, going back to before the Treaty of Paris. So it was pretty clear who the Organic Act was written for. So that's why when we hear the concept, how do we determine who is Chamorro self-determination? We say use the Organic Act definition, because the Organic Act is federal law, is a US law passed by Congress that helped determine who the Chamorro people were. Although in this instance, they called them Guamanians. Okay, next slide. So there you have Article 73, and it says that they're members of the UN, which have or assume responsibility for the administration of territories whose people have not yet attain a full measure of self-government, like Guam, recognize the principle that the interests of the inhabitants of these territories are paramount, and accept as a sacred trust the obligation to promote to the utmost within the system of international peace and security established by the present charter the well-being of the inhabitants of these territories, and to this end. So you see that the obligations are starting to pick up. You had their recognition in the Treaty of Paris, and then you have this obligation. So that's why Guam was put on the non-self-governing list of territories. And just as an historical aside, coming out of World War II, as I said before, the right of conquest, the abrogation of the right of conquest was the basis for most of the war crime trials, which was aggression. So the winners of World War II created the war crime trials. And so you had two classes, you had lots of classes of crimes. One were crimes against humanity, like genocide and cannibalism and punishing people unnecessarily and killing them. And then you also had wars of aggression. And so the UN Charter forever ended the notion that you had right of conquest. And of course, the winners of World War II were the ones who put this into practice through the UN Charter and through international law, although ironically, they were amongst the greatest practitioners of the right of conquest in the past. So both the United Kingdom and France and the United States helped kind of put this system together, even the Soviet Union, and they were the greatest practitioners of the right of conquest in the past. But the way they were seeing it is that was what Japan and Germany and Italy were trying to do, and we're putting an end to that. And we're taking the territories that they had and we're creating trust territories. So all the territories of the losing parties of World War II went into the trust territory system. The territories of the winning team in World War II went to the Article 73 bin. So that's the distinction between the two. So that's why the Micronesia and the TTPI went in another bin and Guam went into this bin. Okay, next slide. And there we have Harry Truman, President Harry Truman, signing another act in which Guam is on the table again. Only this time we have at least one guy from Guam watching. I don't know if he was a participant, but there he is. He's Uncle Carlos Taitano was at least there, unlike in the Treaty of Paris, where there's no Guamanians or CHamoros or Taotao. So this is the Organic Act, which was seen as a very progressive act at the time. I don't want to, it's been demeaned a lot, but it was seen as a very progressive act. And President Truman, ironically, just like President Johnson, were both individuals who became well known for racially progressive policies in American history, even though their personal backgrounds were not in that way. So Harry Truman desegregated the military, and he also wanted to make sure that territories were not managed by Department of Defense. Next slide. So then now what happens after the Organic Act is you have a series of incremental progress, political development. In the 1960s, President LBJ, they created all these federal programs that we're now beneficiaries of, like Medicare, Medicaid, a whole bunch of programs that the federal government expanded dramatically. So Guam became a participant in those programs. Then you had the elective governorship in 1970. And then what they did is in exchange for giving the people of Guam the right to have elective governorship, they eliminated the provision on giving preference in GovGuam employment to persons of Guamanian ancestry. And then they applied the 15th Amendment, which is the amendment that Dave Davis used.
These webinars can be accessed on Humanities Guåhan's Facebook page. To view the online magazine associated with Unincorporated Voting, Voices, and Visions Para Guåhan, visit humanitiesguåhan.org/unincorporated.
Hafa students, I'm Lieutenant Governor Josh Tenorio. For more than a year now, you all have continued to wash your hands and watch your distance from others, and you've done a really great job wearing your masks. We know your parents and guardians have helped you to make these changes to keep yourself and your community safe. As Governor Leon Guerrero said, we are happy you are here. We want you to continue to learn and sharpen your skills with the help of PBS University. This program is the result of a collaborative effort. We couldn't do it alone. I'd like to thank the teachers and support staff of the Guam Department of Education and PBS Guam for their work and their commitment to our students. I'd also like to thank you students for participating at home. To your parents, I'd like to thank you for taking an active role in your child's education. We are all eager to return to a time when all of us can share and study together in person. Until then, we hope you learned something new from this PBS University instruction.